Shabbat Shalom. One of the great pleasures of going to university and having that breadth of education is that you get to take classes and often are exposed to things in depth that perhaps you would never have come across if you had been thrust into work without more time for exploration and guidance by those that were specifically trained. One of the classes I took just as a bit of fun was poetry in university. And although I never became a poet, I learned to appreciate poetry much better by studying it with a good professor. And one of the exercises that we had to try and reflect on how poetry worked and why poetry worked was to try and imagine describing things to somebody that had never seen them, but had some other shared frame of reference. The most classic, of course, is how do you describe colors to somebody that is blind? Or how can you describe sound to a person that is deaf? If I were to ask you, for example, to describe the color red to somebody that is blind, what might you say? Hot, exactly. Red and heat, they go together very well. And you might say that red is a color that is like the feeling of the heat from a fireplace on your face. Or it is like the warm sun coming through the window in the afternoon. And you find the cat laying nearby. But that's not actually what red is it? Right? I mean, technically red isn't actually hot. And technically red is not actually the feeling of the sun. It is a particular wavelength of color that is caused by the vibration of the light in a particular way. It's not actually heat. So why does that work in poetry? Why as human beings, do we resonate to metaphor and simile and comparison and analogy? Why does it work? A degree of association. So there is good poetry and bad poetry. If I say red is the color of scrambled eggs, that's probably not going to work for somebody who's blind, and it's not going to work for the rest of us who are sighted either. But that it can work at all depends on something a little bit more subtle in how our minds process information. Because poetry ultimately, whether we are describing something to somebody who lacks a sense that we have or not, but even when talking to people that are able to perceive the world presumably as we do, poetry reminds us that there is a level of understanding to the world that cannot be simply reduced to facts and figures, wavelengths of light, that it cannot be simply reduced to a prose encyclopedic statement, but instead there are emotions, there are feelings that are ephemeral and unreproducible that must be conveyed through some other avenue, some other tool set. And poetry is that tool set. It allows us to speak of things which otherwise would be beyond our vocabulary. And that is an amazing gift that God has given us. When she created the world, it created a sense of metaphor and poetry within the human spirit. And if you recognize that she allows us to share with each other feelings in a more powerful way than simply writing it out in static descriptive text, that through the avenue of language, we unlock ourselves and we are able to then share that treasure within us, then we can marvel at what she's done. Now, I know that at least one of you is noticing what I'm doing here. She. Do we normally use that pronoun when describing God? But pronouns are metaphor for God. Because God is not a noun in the classical sense of the word, because God is not a person, place, or thing. And yet, we are forced by our language to use language to try and describe God. All language to describe God is a metaphor. Now, we slip into a routine, primarily because Hebrews set a precedent, of mostly using masculine inflected language when talking about God. But we have to be careful, because that is but a metaphor, an approximation, an attempt to share information about that which is fundamentally unknowable in completeness for human minds. But there is still something jarring about feminine metaphor for God, a feminine pronoun. I can always feel when people perk up a little bit if you use a female set of pronouns for God. And yet it is not that unusual. In this week's Haftarah, as well as many others, God is described through feminine metaphor. God is the mother that cannot forget her children. God is the one who has suckled the nation at her breast and can no more forget us than a woman who had done the same would be able to forget her babe. There is something powerful about that metaphor that could not just be conveyed by saying, God doesn't forget us, but by using a human experience, something that we can relate to, a frame of reference that is shared, we can begin to tap into the emotion that Isaiah is trying to share with us. We know what it is to see a baby in the arms of the mother. We know what it is to see the love of the mother pouring out into the child just as the nourishment pours into it. And that creates a bridge for our minds to be able to scramble a little bit more understanding of what God feels towards us. It's not perfect, because our minds cannot fully contain the completeness of God, but it moves us a little closer. When the prophet Hosea talks about God acting like a mother bear defending her cubs and attacking those who have wronged God, we get a very different conception. Again, a feminine conception, but a feminine conception of righteous anger and indignation. Anyone who has ever come across a mother bear, or at least shared in the metaphor passed through the idiom of our language, knows that a mother bear is going to be considered one of the most dangerous and ferocious creatures you could ever come across. And so when using that feminine form, we unlock another part of our understanding that couldn't be captured by just saying, God is really, really going to be upset. You can hear the difference, yes? But if we just use boring, descriptive prose, the emotion disappears, the connection disappears, and we are left with a stale shadow of thought that can't penetrate to move us. Time and time again throughout the prophets, throughout the Psalms, and even in the Torah itself, God is reflected in a more feminine form. And yet, time and time again, in our contemporary world, people will lean upon the masculine imagination of God as though it were somehow the only way to conceive of God, the only way to understand God within the human mind. Both a masculine as well as a feminine understanding of God are flawed and limited, because God is neither. But both of them are also needed, because we are limited. And every possible avenue that our tradition has given us to understand God must be seized upon. We cannot recoil from using a pronoun she any more than we recoil from using the pronoun he. As long as we understand that these are vague approximations that are meant for us to grope closer to an understanding of God that penetrates deeper into our sense of spirit and soul, we're okay. It's not easy. Poetry never is. It will always take longer to interpret that which was written in poetic form than that which was written in prose. But through that struggle, through uncovering the different avenues of understanding of God, whether they be a metaphor couched in feminine terms, masculine terms, or in completely impersonal terms without any gender identity, whatever avenue we have brings us a little closer. Do not get caught up fighting over God is more masculine or God is more feminine. God is ultimately beyond either, but only by taking every avenue of approach, every metaphor that has been granted to us by the visions of our prophets, can we at least get closer. Shabbat Shalom.